A black grandma feeds 8 Hell's Angels on Thanksgiving, and the whole town calls her crazy. But when those bikers take off into the cold night, something unbelievable starts to happen. She thought it was just one meal, until strangers begin showing up at her door, letters from across the country, people she's never met saying her kindness changed their lives. And then, 1 year later, the ground starts rumbling again. Hundreds of engines, hundreds of riders, 300 bikers returning to her tiny town, this time not for trouble, but for something sacred. But when tragedy strikes right after the miracle, this grandma's faith will face the hardest test of her life. Can one act of kindness really change the world? Or will the price of compassion be more than she can bear? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Evelyn Mae Jackson's feet hit the cold floor of her bedroom. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a sharpness in the air that made her bones creak, but her spirit was as warm as ever. Through her window, she watched leaves skitter across her small front yard, dancing in the November wind that whistled through Hollow Creek's quiet streets. "Lord, thank you for another beautiful morning," she whispered, wrapping her well-worn robe tighter around her shoulders. Her kitchen, with its faded yellow curtains and collection of magnets from church events, welcomed her like an old friend. As she pulled out her mixing bowls and measuring cups, the chill crept under the door, but Evelyn just hummed louder. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound!" Her rich voice filled the kitchen while her hands worked the soft dough for her famous buttermilk biscuits. The phone's sharp ring cut through her hymn. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and smiled at the familiar number. "Mama, you're up already?" Ruth's worried voice carried from Atlanta. "Baby girl, these biscuits won't bake themselves," Evelyn chuckled. "It's freezing out there, Mama. The weather report says it's the coldest Thanksgiving in 10 years. Please tell me you're staying inside after you drop off the food." "Now, Ruth." "And keep your doors locked," Ruth added firmly. "Mrs. Wilson said she saw some strange cars driving through town yesterday." Evelyn shook her head, flour dust dancing in her silver hair. "The Lord's got angels watching over me, sweetheart. Don't you worry about your mama." "That's what makes me worry more," Ruth sighed. "Your angels can't stop someone from taking advantage of your kindness." "The day I stop being kind is the day I stop believing in grace," Evelyn replied softly. "Now let me finish these biscuits before they turn to rocks." The wind had picked up by the time Evelyn loaded her car with sweet potato pies, biscuits, and her famous green bean casserole. The cold bit through her thick sweater as she carefully drove to Hollow Creek First Baptist, where she'd cooked weekly dinners for 20 years. But instead of the usual bustle of volunteers, she found Deacon Thompson standing at the locked doors, his face drawn with concern. "Miss Evelyn," he called out, hurrying to help with her dishes. "The heating system gave out last night. Pastor James says we can't have folks sitting in here freezing, especially the little ones and elderly. We're having to cancel." "Cancel? On Thanksgiving?" Evelyn's heart sank as she looked at all the food she'd prepared. "I'm sorry, Miss Evelyn. We tried everything to get it fixed, but no repair service is open today." The drive home felt longer than usual, her car heavy with unused food and disappointment. The afternoon light was already growing thin when she finally set her small table for one, trying not to think about all the people who'd been counting on a hot meal today. That's when she heard it, the low rumble of motorcycles, growing louder until it seemed to shake her windows. Evelyn peered out to see 8 massive bikes parked along her street, their leather-clad riders gathering around one motorcycle with obvious trouble. Her neighbors' curtains twitched as they peeked out at the unexpected visitors. These weren't the clean-cut weekend riders who sometimes passed through town. These men wore patched jackets with Hell's Angels emblazoned across their backs, their beards wild and faces weathered. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she watched them, but then she felt it, that familiar nudge in her spirit, as clear as if someone had whispered in her ear. Feed them. Lord, you sure know how to test a woman's faith, she murmured, straightening her spine. Her heart was racing, but her steps were steady as she walked to her front door. The cold air rushed in as she opened it, causing the riders to look up in surprise. Standing on her porch, Evelyn called out in a clear voice that carried across her yard, "Y'all hungry?" The stillness that followed was broken only by the whistling wind. 8 pairs of eyes stared at her, probably as startled by her invitation as she was by her own boldness. But Evelyn Mae Jackson had learned long ago that faith wasn't about feeling brave. It was about doing what's right even when your knees were shaking. She could almost hear Ruth's voice in her head, scolding her for this foolishness. But as she stood there, warm light spilling out behind her onto her porch, Evelyn thought about all that food sitting in her kitchen, meant for sharing. She thought about how many times she'd read about Jesus feeding strangers, and how many times she'd sung about God's mysterious ways. The wind whipped around her, carrying the scent of her sweet potato pies through the open door. She watched as one of the bikers, the largest of them, with a silver beard and hands like baseball mitts, sniffed the air appreciatively. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Are you sure about that offer?" Evelyn felt her smile grow warmer, more certain. "Honey, I've got enough food in here to feed 20 people, and it'd be a shame before the Lord to let it go to waste. Besides," she added, "looks like that tire isn't getting fixed anytime soon, and I know for a fact there's not a garage open in town today." The 8 bikers exchanged glances, their weathered faces a mix of uncertainty and hunger. Rex Steele Carson, standing a head taller than the others, stepped forward first. His leather vest creaked as he moved, patches and pins catching the porch light. "We don't want to impose, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but respectful. Evelyn waved away his concern. "The Lord didn't make this food for me to eat alone. Come on in before you catch your death in this cold." They filed in carefully, these large men suddenly careful as cats in a china shop. Their boots, usually thundering on pavement, now stepped softly on her worn carpet. The warmth from her wood stove wrapped around them, and several unconsciously rubbed their chapped hands together. "Kitchen's this way," Evelyn directed, leading them through her modest home. Family photos lined the walls, children's graduations, church gatherings, her late husband's smile frozen in time. Biblical verses in delicate frames dotted the spaces between, their golden letters catching the light. The bikers settled awkwardly around her dining table and the card table she'd set up for overflow. Some perched like they might need to flee at any moment. Evelyn bustled about, setting out cornbread still warm from the oven. "Help yourselves," she encouraged. "But first, let me know who I'm feeding. I'm Evelyn Mae Jackson." One by one, they introduced themselves. Rex Steele Carson spoke first, then came Dragon, Bear, Hawk, and others, road names that seemed at odds with their cautious politeness in her floral, wallpapered dining room. Before serving the turkey, Evelyn stood at the head of the table. "I always say grace before meals," she announced. "You're welcome to join or just sit quiet." Rex removed his cap immediately, surprising his brothers. The others followed suit, heads bowing awkwardly. Some closed their eyes, while others stared at their empty plates. "Dear Lord," Evelyn began, her voice warm and clear, "thank you for bringing these children to my table today. Bless this food to our bodies and our fellowship to our spirits. Amen." The men mumbled, "Amen," in various tones of practice and rust. As Evelyn served heaping plates of turkey, greens, and all the fixings, the stiffness in the room began to thaw. "This is better than my mama's cooking," Bear admitted after his first bite, then quickly added, "Don't tell her I said that." Evelyn laughed. "Your secret's safe with me, honey." As they ate, stories began to surface. Dragon spoke of 3 years in prison and a daughter who wouldn't speak to him. Hawk mentioned his divorce, voice cracking slightly. Rex stayed, quiet. But his eyes never left Evelyn as she moved around the table, topping off drinks and offering seconds. "Baby, you're still here?" she said softly to Dragon, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "That means God ain't done with you yet." The words landed like a balm. Dragon ducked his head, but not before Evelyn saw his eyes shine with tears. Hawk was reaching for more cornbread when his elbow caught one of Evelyn's delicate teacups. It crashed to the floor, shattering in the sudden silence. Horror crossed his face. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he stammered, already pushing back his chair. "I'll pay for it." "It's just a cup," Evelyn interrupted gently. "You're what matters." The tension broke as Bear let out a relieved laugh. "Miss Evelyn, you're something else," he said, shaking his head in wonder. As the evening drew to a close, the men insisted on helping with the dishes. Massive hands that had gripped motorcycle handlebars for countless miles now carefully dried her china. They talked more freely now, sharing jokes and stories that filled her kitchen with unexpected warmth. When the last plate was put away, Rex approached Evelyn. "Ma'am, we can never repay your kindness." "Wasn't my kindness," she replied simply. "Was the Lord's. You just happened to break down in front of the right house." The rumble of motorcycles soon filled her street again, but this time the sound carried a different meaning. Evelyn stood on her porch, watching them mount their bikes. Rex, last to leave, turned back, his leather-gloved hand raised in a wave, a gesture somehow both gentle and profound. As the taillights disappeared into the darkness, Evelyn felt tears roll down her cheeks. They weren't sad tears, nor happy ones exactly. They were the kind that come when something moves so deep in your soul that crying is the only response that makes sense. She watched until the last growl of engines faded into the night, leaving only the whisper of the cold wind and the warmth of answered prayers in her heart. The morning sun barely peeked over Hollow Creek's horizon when the whispers began. At May's Diner, the breakfast crowd huddled over steaming coffee cups, their voices low but urgent. "Did you hear about Evelyn Jackson?" Betty Sue, the waitress, leaned close to Mrs. Thompson's ear. "Had a whole gang of bikers in her house yesterday. Hell's Angels, they say." "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Thompson clutched her pearl necklace. "Has she lost her mind?" The bell above the diner's door chimed as more regulars filed in, each carrying their own version of the story. Some said there were 20 bikers, others swore they saw weapons. By 9 o'clock, the tale had grown so wild that Evelyn had supposedly hosted an entire motorcycle convention in her modest home. Around 10:30, Reverend Thomas Coleman's car pulled into Evelyn's driveway. His face wore the concerned expression he reserved for difficult pastoral visits. Evelyn watched through her kitchen window as he straightened his tie before approaching her door. "Sister Evelyn," he began after she welcomed him inside, "the whole town's talking about what happened yesterday." "Would you like some sweet potato pie, Reverend?" Evelyn asked, already moving toward her kitchen. "Just baked it fresh this morning." The pastor followed her, his worried frown deepening. "Sister Evelyn, this is serious. You put yourself in terrible danger. Those men? They're not church folks. They're known troublemakers, criminals even." Evelyn set a generous slice of pie before him, the aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg filling the air. Maybe Danger needed a plate too, she said simply, settling into her chair across from him. Reverend Coleman sighed, absently picking up his fork. I understand your heart was in the right place, but we have to be wise about these things. What if they'd hurt you? What if they come back? Then I'll need to bake more pies, Evelyn replied, her eyes twinkling. The pastor took a bite of pie, momentarily distracted by its perfection. Sister Evelyn, he continued, though with less conviction, the church has protocols for helping strangers. Next time, please call me first. Reverend, Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. Sometimes the Lord doesn't give us time for protocols. Sometimes he just says, "Feed my sheep," and we have to trust him about which sheep he means. The conversation continued until the pie was finished, neither fully convincing the other, but both parting with genuine affection and respect. As afternoon settled into evening, Evelyn was reading her Bible when she heard a soft thud on her porch. Peering through the window, she saw no one, but there sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. With careful fingers, she unwrapped it. Inside was a black leather jacket, smaller than the ones the bikers wore, clearly meant for her. Across its back, hand-painted in careful strokes, were the words, "You fed us when nobody else would." Evelyn's hands trembled as she held it. The leather was soft, the painting precise and beautiful. It spoke of time spent, of thought given, of gratitude expressed in the language they knew best. The phone rang, startling her from her contemplation. Ruth's number flashed on the caller ID. "Mama." Her daughter's voice was sharp with worry. "Mrs. Thompson just called me. Said you had a gang in your house yesterday. Please tell me that's not true." "Hello to you too, baby," Evelyn said calmly. "And it wasn't a gang, just some hungry folks who needed a meal." "Hungry folks?" Ruth's voice rose. "Mama, they were Hell's Angels. Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? What were you thinking?" "They were hungry, Ruth. That's all." Evelyn fingered the leather jacket as she spoke. "Sometimes that's all we need to know about somebody." "This isn't like feeding the church ladies, Mama. These men are criminals. You could have been hurt or robbed or worse." Ruth's voice cracked slightly. "I can't lose you to this kind of foolishness." "Baby," Evelyn said softly, "your daddy used to say that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any at all. I'm still here, aren't I? Still in one piece, still making pies." The conversation ended as it usually did, with Ruth exasperated and Evelyn serene, neither quite understanding the other's perspective, but both secure in their love. Later that night, Evelyn knelt beside her bed for her evening prayers. The leather jacket lay across her quilt, its message gleaming in the lamplight. For the first time since yesterday's events, doubt crept into her mind. "Lord," she whispered, "was I being foolish or faithful? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." She touched the jacket's smooth surface. "Those men, they've got such hurt in them, such hunger that ain't just about food." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "But Lord, what if Ruth's right? What if I'm being naive?" The room was quiet, except for the tick of her bedside clock and the distant sound of crickets. Evelyn rose from her knees, her joints protesting slightly, and picked up the jacket. She folded it carefully, reverently, as if it were made of fine silk instead of leather. Placing it on her bed, she whispered into the stillness, "Lord, I hope you know what you started." The jacket lay there like a question mark, or perhaps an answer. Evelyn wasn't sure which. But as she prepared for bed, she felt a deep peace settling over her, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from trust. The autumn chill settled deeper into Hollow Creek as November faded into December. Evelyn maintained her usual routines, though nothing felt quite usual anymore. Each morning, she'd sit at her kitchen table with her Bible and a cup of coffee, watching the sun paint golden stripes across her worn linoleum floor. On a crisp Tuesday morning, while Evelyn was hanging fresh curtains, she heard the rumble of a motorcycle outside. Her heart skipped a beat, memories of Thanksgiving night still fresh in her mind. Through the window, she saw a young man in a leather jacket cutting the engine. He couldn't have been more than 25, with close-cropped hair and nervous energy in his movements. "Ma'am?" he called out, standing awkwardly by her broken fence. "Rex, Steele, sent me. Said your fence needed fixing." Evelyn opened her door, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the morning air. "Did he now?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm good with wood. Used to help my grandpa with stuff like this." He shifted from foot to foot. "Steele said we look after our own." Our own. The words warmed her heart more than they probably should have. "Well then," Evelyn smiled, "let me at least fix you some breakfast while you work." The young man, Tommy was his name, worked efficiently, replacing broken posts and straightening the whole stretch of fence. Inside, Evelyn could hear her neighbors' phones buzzing with texts about the biker back at Miss Evelyn's. 3 days later, Evelyn returned, from visiting Sister Johnson in the hospital, to find 4 large paper bags on her porch. They were filled with groceries, fresh vegetables, meat, bread, and even her favorite brand of coffee. No note, just abundant provision left with quiet care. The letters started arriving the following week. The first one came from Macon, Georgia. "Dear Mrs. Jackson, I heard about what you did for those bikers on Thanksgiving. My brother rides with them sometimes. He said you treated them like sons instead of sinners. Made me cry thinking about it. Thank you for showing there's still good people in this world." More letters followed. Some from other riders, some from their families. A mother in Tennessee, whose son had died on his bike, wrote about how the story gave her peace. A pastor in Mississippi shared how he'd used Evelyn's story in his sermon about modern-day Good Samaritans. Evelyn began keeping the letters in an old shoebox she labeled Grace in her neat handwriting. Each night she'd read a few before bed, marveling at how far a simple act of kindness could travel. But not everyone saw it as kindness. At the grocery store, Mrs. Thompson steered her cart down another aisle when she saw Evelyn coming. At church, some people sat a little further away than they used to. Ruth called more frequently now, her voice tight with concern. "Mama, I saw your story shared on Facebook," she said one evening. "People are talking about you all over the internet. This isn't safe." "Baby, the Lord's got me covered," Evelyn replied, though she had to admit the attention was a bit overwhelming. "That's not how it works, Mama. Bad people might see this and think you're an easy target. They might—" "Maybe those are the only kind left that need saving," Evelyn interrupted gently. The line went quiet for a moment. "What does that even mean?" Ruth sighed. "It means sometimes the Lord sends us the people everybody else has given up on, and maybe that's exactly where we need to be." As December progressed, Evelyn found herself looking at her dining table differently. The scratch marks from Thanksgiving night were still visible, little imperfections that now felt like sacred scars. She'd set out 8 plates that night, not knowing she was setting a table for something much bigger than dinner. The church's Christmas preparations were in full swing, but Evelyn's mind kept drifting back to Thanksgiving. She polished her silverware and stored extra plates in the cabinet, somehow knowing they'd be needed again. The leather jacket hung in her closet, a reminder that sometimes God's call came wrapped in unexpected packages. One morning, while baking cookies for the church's Christmas bazaar, Evelyn heard familiar whispers from her neighbors' porches. Another biker had been spotted nearby, but instead of fear, she felt a strange peace. Her table had become more than furniture. It was turning into a mission field, a place where grace could work its quiet miracles. She looked at her growing shoebox of letters, each one a testimony to how far ripples could spread from a single act of obedience. The story that began with 8 hungry riders had somehow grown wings, carrying hope across highways and into hearts she'd never meet. That evening, as she sorted through her Christmas decorations, Evelyn found herself humming "Amazing Grace." The tune felt different now, more real, more raw. She understood better than ever why grace was called amazing. It had the power to turn a fearful moment into a feast, strangers into family, and one simple yes into 1,000 possibilities. The seasons turned like pages in Evelyn's well-worn Bible, each month bringing its own kind of grace. Winter melted into spring, spring bloomed into summer, and before she knew it, another autumn painted Hollow Creek in shades of gold and crimson. Through it all, Evelyn's life maintained its quiet rhythm. She still baked her sweet potato pies, visited the sick, and hummed hymns while doing her dishes. But something had shifted in the way people saw her. The story of that Thanksgiving night had taken on a life of its own. One Sunday in March, Reverend Coleman asked her to speak to the congregation about feeding the least of these. Evelyn stood at the pulpit, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her reading glasses. "I didn't do nothing special," she began, her voice soft but clear. "Just opened my door when the Lord knocked." The congregation leaned forward, hungry for more details about the night she'd fed the bikers. But Evelyn kept it simple, speaking more about God's love than her own actions. Throughout the year, small kindnesses continued appearing at her door. Sometimes it was motorcycle boots on her porch, belonging to riders stopping by to check on her. Other times it was regular folks from town, bringing covered dishes or asking for prayer. Her dining room table became a gathering place for the lonely, the lost, and the curious. Mrs. Thompson from the grocery store eventually came around, bringing a pound cake and sheepish apology. "I was wrong to judge," she admitted over coffee. "Your courage changed how I see people." As October painted the trees in brilliant colors, Evelyn felt a familiar stirring in her spirit. Thanksgiving was approaching again, and this time she wanted to do something bigger. Not just wait for God to send people to her door. She wanted to invite them herself. One morning, she sat at her kitchen table with her best stationery and carefully wrote out 2 signs in her neat handwriting. Thanksgiving dinner. All welcome, no questions asked. She posted one at Johnson's General Store, right next to the community bulletin board where people advertised yard sales and lost cats. The other went up on the church notice board after Sunday service. Some folks whispered that she was asking for trouble. Others admired her faith but worried about her health. At 73 years old, Evelyn wasn't as strong as she used to be, though her spirit remained mighty. When Ruth came to visit on a crisp November weekend, she brought bags full of groceries from Atlanta and a heart full of concern. The kitchen filled with the smell of coffee as mother and daughter faced each other across the worn Formica table. "Mama, you can't feed half the county," Ruth exclaimed, gesturing at the growing collection of canned goods and baking supplies. "You're not as young as you used to be. What if too many people show up? What if—" "I got faith," Evelyn interrupted gently, reaching across to pat her daughter's hand. "And a big enough table?" She smiled at the dining room table that had witnessed so many miracles over the past year. "Faith won't keep you from wearing yourself out," Ruth persisted. But her voice had softened. She saw the light in her mother's eyes, the same determination that had guided their family through harder times than these. They spent the weekend cooking together, freezing casseroles and planning the menu. Despite her protests, Ruth found herself caught up in her mother's quiet excitement. She even helped write out place cards, leaving the names blank for whoever might come. As November progressed, responses to Evelyn's invitation began trickling in. The church secretary reported calls from people asking if it was real. if anyone truly could come. Some were familiar voices from town, others from further away. Evelyn answered each inquiry the same way. "Come on over. There's plenty of room." The day before Thanksgiving, Ruth reluctantly headed back to Atlanta, extracting promises from her mother to call if things got overwhelming. "The Lord will send exactly who needs to be here," Evelyn assured her, hugging her tight. That night, Evelyn sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking at her dining room table. She'd extended it to its full length, adding both leaves. The leather jacket from last year hung on a hook nearby, a reminder of how God could turn fear into fellowship. Thanksgiving morning dawned gray and cool. Evelyn woke early, as was her habit, and went through her morning devotions. As she sipped her coffee, she watched dark clouds gathering on the horizon, heavy with the promise of rain. Standing at her kitchen window, Evelyn felt that familiar mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The wind was picking up, rattling the autumn leaves against her window pane. Her table stood ready, her kitchen warm with the smell of baking bread. "Let's see who the Lord sends this time," she whispered, watching the clouds roll in. In her heart, she knew that whoever came through her door today would be exactly who was meant to be there. That's how grace worked. It had its own guest list, written in a hand far wiser than hers. The air felt charged with possibility, just like it had a year ago when the rumble of motorcycles changed everything. Evelyn smiled and turned to check her sweet potato pies, humming "Amazing Grace" under her breath as the first drops of rain began to fall. The late morning sun broke through the clouds as Evelyn carefully basted her 20-pound turkey, making sure every inch glistened with herb-flecked butter. Her hands moved with practiced grace, even as her thoughts wandered to who might show up at her door this year. The quiet of her kitchen was suddenly interrupted by a low, distant rumble. At first, she thought it was thunder rolling through the valley, but the sound grew steadier, more mechanical. It reminded her of last Thanksgiving, but bigger somehow. Much bigger. Wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron, Evelyn stepped out onto her front porch. The sight before her made her knees go weak. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. Hundreds of motorcycles were approaching down Main Street, their headlights cutting through the misty morning like a river of stars. The sound was deafening now, a symphony of engines that echoed off the hills. Bikes of every make and model filled the road as far as she could see. All across Hollow Creek, people emerged from their homes. Miss Betty next door stood frozen on her porch, clutching her housecoat. The Johnson kids jumped up and down in their front yard, waving wildly at the parade of riders. Even old Mr. Peterson, who complained about everything, watched in slack-jawed wonder from his rocking chair. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She hit speed dial for Reverend Coleman while hurrying toward the church, her sensible shoes clicking against the sidewalk. "Reverend," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "we're gonna need more tables, a lot more tables." "What do you mean, Sister Evelyn?" he asked, confusion clear in his tone. "Just come to the church, quick as you can." She hung up and picked up her pace. Thank goodness some church volunteers had already gathered extra food there, preparing for what they thought would be a modest community meal. But this was something else entirely. The church parking lot began filling with motorcycles, their chrome gleaming in the strengthening sunlight. Evelyn recognized patches from dozens of different groups: Hell's Angels mixed with Christian riders, veteran groups alongside clubs she'd only heard whispered about in worried tones. Some wore patches that marked them as rivals, yet here they were, parking side by side, greeting each other with nods and handshakes. And there, leading them all, was Rex Steele Carson. His familiar figure sat tall on his bike, holding high a hand-painted sign that read, "Thanksgiving at Grandma's," in bold red letters. The sight of it made fresh tears spill down Evelyn's cheeks. He dismounted and strode toward her, his weathered face split by a wide grin. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She rushed forward and threw her arms around his massive frame, not caring that her apron was getting crushed against his leather vest. "You boys sure know how to make an entrance," she laughed through her tears, stepping back to look up at him. Rex's eyes were suspiciously bright as he replied, "Well, word got around about your invitation. Seems like everybody wanted to come to Grandma's for Thanksgiving this year." More riders were still arriving, the rumble of engines mixing with laughter and greetings. Church members began emerging from the building, carrying folding tables and chairs. Reverend Coleman stood in the doorway, his usual careful expression replaced by something like wonder. The parking lot became a blur of activity. Leather-clad bikers worked alongside church ladies in their Sunday best, setting up tables in long rows. Someone brought out a portable sound system, and gospel music mixed with classic rock floated through the air. The smell of Evelyn's turkey mingled with dozens of other dishes as people kept arriving, carrying covered plates and crock-pots. Mrs. Henderson from the choir clutched her famous green bean casserole, looking uncertain, until a tall biker with a gray beard gallantly offered to carry it for her. Soon they were deep in conversation about proper seasoning techniques. Deacon Williams, who'd been so worried about those motorcycle types last year, found himself sharing stories with a group of veterans, their different worlds bridged by shared service and sacrifice. Children darted between the forest of legs, some asking for rides on motorcycles, while their parents nervously negotiated with grinning riders about just around the parking lot, real slow. The tables filled with an impossible variety of food, traditional Southern dishes alongside contributions from riders who'd come from all over the country. Someone had brought 3 kinds of tamales. Another had driven through the night with his grandmother's secret recipe pierogi. As the sun climbed higher, Evelyn looked around at the scene before her. Church dresses and leather jackets moved together in an unlikely dance of community. Prayers were shared, stories swapped, and laughter rang out in every direction. The barriers that usually divided people seemed to melt away under the simple power of shared food and open hearts. Rex appeared at her elbow with a plate piled high. "You did this," he said softly. "One simple act of kindness last year, and look what grew from it." Evelyn shook her head, smiling. "The Lord did this. I just opened my door." The music swelled as more voices joined in an impromptu chorus of "Amazing Grace," the harmony carrying across the parking lot and up into the Alabama sky. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, feeling the vibration of hundreds of voices united in song. Inside the church hall, the mingling of aromas created an intoxicating symphony. Roasted turkey, spiced pumpkin pies, and dozens of home-cooked dishes filled every available surface. The clatter of plates and silverware provided a steady rhythm beneath the unusual but harmonious blend of Amazing Grace and Born to be Wild playing from different speakers. The serving line became a beautiful dance of leather and lace, rough hands and manicured ones working in perfect sync. Mrs. Thompson, who'd never missed a church potluck in 30 years, stood shoulder to shoulder with a burly biker named Tank, both of them ladling out steaming portions of her famous chicken and dumplings. "Now, honey, you make sure everybody gets some of the carrots too," she instructed Tank, who nodded seriously and adjusted his serving technique. Children darted between tables, their eyes wide with excitement. Little Jenny Williams, usually so shy, perched proudly on a gleaming Harley while her mother snapped photos. The bike's owner, a gruff-looking man covered in tattoos, carefully explained each chrome detail to the fascinated 6-year-old. Throughout the hall, unlikely connections bloomed like flowers after rain. Sarah Cooper, who'd lost her son in Afghanistan, found herself embraced by 3 veteran bikers who shared their own stories of loss and healing. They cried together over slices of her apple pie, the tears washing away years of isolation. As the afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, Evelyn made her way to the front of the hall. The room gradually quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward her. She smoothed her apron, her hands trembling slightly. "Lord," she began, her voice clear and strong despite her age, "you told us about a feast where the master sent his servants into the streets to bring in everyone they could find. Well, here we are." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. "Some folks asked me why I opened my door that cold night last year. Truth is, I just remembered what Jesus said about the table being big enough for everyone." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, weathered and smooth, young and old, marked by hard lives and easier ones. "And look what he did with that little yes. Look how he made the table bigger than any of us could have imagined." Reverend Coleman stood near the back, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. His earlier reservations had melted away in the face of such undeniable grace. When he caught Evelyn's eye, he nodded, a gesture of both apology and blessing. Ruth lingered by the door, watching her mother shine. She'd arrived that morning full of worry, but now she understood. The light radiating from her mother wasn't fragility. It was power, the kind that could transform hearts and heal ancient wounds. As evening approached, the gathering took on a more solemn tone. Bikers began pulling out small lanterns, lighting them one by one. Rex stepped forward to explain. "Each light represents someone we've lost along the way," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Brothers and sisters who never found their way home to a table like this." The lanterns cast a warm glow across faces marked by remembrance. Names were whispered, stories shared in hushed tones. Evelyn moved among them, touching shoulders, offering hugs, her presence a balm to long-carried grief. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing them home," she whispered, watching the lights flicker like earth-bound stars. As the evening drew to a close, Rex found Evelyn sitting quietly at an empty table. He lowered his massive frame into the chair beside her, leather creaking. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" he said, gesturing at the room still full of lingering conversations and warm embraces. "We're coming back every year now. You got us forever, Grandma." The morning after the grand Thanksgiving gathering dawned with heavy gray clouds that seemed to blanket Hollow Creek in a somber embrace. Evelyn stood at her kitchen sink, warm water running over her weathered hands as she hummed Amazing Grace. Steam rose from the sink as she methodically worked through the stack of dishes she'd brought home from the church hall. Her small kitchen still held echoes of yesterday's joy. A forgotten leather glove on the counter, thank you notes hastily scribbled on paper napkins, and the lingering scent of fellowship that seemed to cling to every surface. She picked up another plate, smiling at the memory of Tank insisting on helping serve the chicken and dumplings. "Lord," she whispered, "thank you for showing us all what your table really looks like." The clock on her wall ticked steadily toward noon. Outside, a few drops of rain began to tap against the window panes, creating a gentle rhythm that matched her quiet humming. She hadn't heard from Ruth yet. Her daughter usually called the day after any big event to check on her. But Evelyn understood. Sometimes city life kept you too busy for morning calls. The phone's sharp ring cut through her peaceful reverie. Wiping her hands on her apron, she reached for the receiver, expecting Ruth's voice. Instead, she heard heavy breathing and what sounded like muffled sobs. "Mrs. Jackson?" The voice was unfamiliar, shaking with emotion. "This is Danny, one of Rex's riders." Something in his tone made Evelyn grip the counter. The dish in her other hand trembled. "There's been an accident, ma'am, on Highway 23. Danny's voice cracked. "Rex, the truck came out of nowhere. They say he was gone before the ambulance." The plate slipped from Evelyn's grasp, shattering on the linoleum floor. Her knees gave way, and she sank down beside the broken pieces, phone still pressed to her ear. "No, Lord," she whispered. "Not him. Please, not him." Danny was still talking, something about arrangements and notifications, but his words seemed to come from very far away. All Evelyn could hear was Rex's voice from the night before. "You got us forever, Grandma." She didn't know how long she sat there, surrounded by broken china and broken dreams. The rain outside had picked up, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. The doorbell's chime startled her back to awareness. Through her front window she saw them. News vans with satellite dishes, reporters clutching microphones, cameras already rolling. Someone had tipped them off about Rex's death and its connection to last year's Thanksgiving miracle. Her simple act of kindness was about to become a headline. "Biker Grandma's Angel Falls," read one hastily printed article that someone thrust through her mail slot. "Holiday Hero's Tragic End," declared another. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. Local papers, national networks, radio stations all wanting to know how she felt, what message she had for their audiences. The town, which had watched yesterday's gathering with cautious warmth, now preened in the spotlight. Mayor Wilson gave interviews about our Evelyn Mae Jackson and her Ministry of Hospitality. The diner started advertising Biker Grandma's special. Even Reverend Coleman spoke to reporters about the transformative power of Sister Jackson's faithful witness. But Evelyn felt hollow. She moved through her house like a ghost, touching the leather jacket they'd given her, reading through the letters in her grace box, seeking something, anything, that would tell her she'd done more than just feed a hungry man before he died. As evening settled over Hollow Creek, she found herself sitting at her dining room table. The same table where it had all begun 1 year ago. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, a lonely sound that emphasized the crushing silence. No motorcycles rumbling past, no leather-clad angels bringing unexpected grace. "Did I help him, Lord?" she asked the empty room, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Or did I just feed him one last time?" The question hung in the air, heavy as grief. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of tire tracks from her driveway. Tomorrow would bring more reporters, more questions, more attempts to turn her pain into a story of inspiration. But tonight, in the quiet of her home, Evelyn Mae Jackson mourned not for the biker grandma they wanted her to be, but for the man who had become family over one Thanksgiving meal. She touched the empty chair where Rex had sat, remembering his gruff laugh, his gentle way with the children, the tears in his eyes when they lit the lanterns. Forever had turned out to be so very short. The days after Rex's death blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Evelyn's mailbox overflowed with letters, thick envelopes from across the country, each one bearing messages of condolence and hope. She stacked them unopened in cardboard boxes, unable to face the weight of strangers' sympathy. The morning sun filtered through her kitchen window, casting long shadows across unopened letters scattered on her table. Her hands trembled as she made her morning coffee, spilling drops on the counter she'd once kept spotless. The house that had buzzed with life and laughter weeks ago now felt like a museum of memories she couldn't bear to dust. When Reverend Coleman called about the memorial service, Evelyn's voice cracked as she declined. "I just can't, Reverend, not yet." The thought of sitting in that church, hearing people speak about Rex as if they'd known him, made her chest tighten with an invisible vice. "The whole town wants to honor him," the pastor pressed gently. The whole town didn't know him, Evelyn whispered, hanging up before grief could strangle her words completely. Winter settled over Hollow Creek like a heavy blanket, matching Evelyn's mood. She stopped baking, stopped visiting the sick, stopped answering her phone. Her neighbors noticed the darkness in her windows, the untouched newspaper on her porch, the silence where hymns once floated from her open windows. Ruth arrived unannounced one gray afternoon, her city boots crunching on frozen grass. She found her mother sitting in her rocking chair, staring at nothing, thinner than she'd ever seen her. "Mama?" Ruth's voice carried the worry she'd been holding since that terrible phone call. "You haven't been answering my calls." Evelyn looked up, her usually bright eyes dulled by exhaustion. "I'm sorry, baby. I haven't had the words." Ruth knelt beside her mother's chair, taking her cold hands between her warm ones. The role reversal wasn't lost on either of them, the daughter now caring for the mother who'd always been their family's strength. "You need to eat, Mama. You need to let people help you." Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't what Rex would want." At the sound of his name, Evelyn's shoulders began to shake. "I kept thinking if I hadn't started all this—" "You didn't cause his death," Ruth said, squeezing her mother's hands. "You gave him something to live for. Everyone could see how he changed after meeting you." Evelyn pulled her hands away, pressing them against her heart as if to hold in the pain. "Then why does it hurt so much to have faith? Why did God let me love him like a son just to take him away?" Ruth had no answer. She simply held her mother while she cried, understanding for the first time that the strongest faith could sometimes feel like the heaviest burden. The snow started falling as evening approached, coating Hollow Creek in pristine white. Ruth had just finished heating up some soup when they heard the distinctive rumble of a motorcycle engine. Evelyn stiffened in her chair. Through the window, they saw a lone rider parking his bike, his leather jacket dusted with snow. Even in the dim light, Evelyn recognized him. Mick, the quiet young man who'd always stayed close to Rex. The doorbell chimed, and Ruth moved to answer it, but Evelyn stopped her. "No, baby, I need to do this." Mick stood on the porch, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. He carried a worn leather satchel, holding it like something precious. "Mrs. Jackson," he said softly, "I'm sorry it took me so long to bring this." Evelyn invited him in, noticing how he removed his boots without being asked, just as Rex had taught them all to do. In the warm light of her living room, she could see the grief etched in his young face. "Rex wanted you to have this," Mick said, carefully opening the satchel. From it, he pulled out a Bible, its leather cover soft with age and use. "He started carrying it again after that first Thanksgiving. Said you reminded him what it meant to believe." Evelyn's hands shook as she took the Bible. A piece of paper fell from between its pages, a note written in Rex's bold scrawl. "You made me believe again. Keep the light burning." The dam broke. Evelyn clutched the Bible to her chest and wept, not the quiet tears of recent weeks, but deep, soul-cleansing sobs that seemed to come from her very core. Ruth moved to comfort her, but Mick was already reaching for something else in his jacket. Without a word, he placed a thick white candle on her dining table, the same table where it had all begun. He lit it with careful reverence, the flame casting a warm glow that seemed to push back the darkness just a little. "We all carry your light now, Mrs. Jackson," Mick said quietly. Rex made sure of that. He left as silently as he'd come, the sound of his motorcycle fading into the snowy night. Evelyn sat at her table, Rex's Bible in her lap, watching the candle flame dance. Ruth brought her tea, then sat beside her, neither speaking as the hours slipped by. The candle burned steadily, its light reflecting off the window panes and creating countless tiny stars in the darkness. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering everything in a clean, white blanket, as if nature itself was offering a fresh start. The next morning, Evelyn found herself staring at the shoebox marked Grace, sitting untouched on her bedroom shelf. For weeks, she'd been adding new letters without reading any of them, letting the pain build a wall between her and their messages. But something about Mick's visit, about Rex's Bible with its well-worn pages, had shifted something inside her. With trembling hands, she lifted the box down and carried it to her kitchen table, where the candle Mick had lit still stood, though now cold. She made herself a cup of hot tea, wrapped her favorite shawl around her shoulders, and began to read. The first letter was from a veteran in Tennessee. "I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 15 years, he wrote. "But when I heard about what you did, ma'am, something broke inside me. I called her that night. We're having dinner next week." Evelyn had to pause, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She opened another envelope, then another. The stories poured out like a healing river. "Your story made me check myself into rehab. 6 months sober now. Our church started serving dinner every Thursday. We call it Grandma's Table. I judged those boys by their looks until I heard what you did. Now 3 of them volunteer at my shelter." Hour after hour, Evelyn read through the letters. Some were written on fancy stationery, others on notebook paper or even paper towels. Many had photos enclosed, families reunited, church halls filled with unlikely dinner, guests, bikers serving at soup kitchens. Each one spoke of change, of hope, of walls coming down. Near the bottom of the box, she found a small padded envelope. Inside was a flash drive with a sticky note that read, "Play me." Evelyn hesitated. Technology wasn't her strong suit, but she remembered the small laptop Ruth had given her last Christmas for looking at grandkid pictures. It took her 3 tries to get the flash drive inserted correctly, but when she did, a video began to play. The screen filled with faces, some weathered and tattooed, others young and fresh, all looking directly at the camera. "Thank you, Grandma," said a woman with pink hair, wiping tears. "Thank you, Grandma," echoed a group of bikers standing beside their motorcycles. "Thank you, Grandma," said a little girl sitting on her father's shoulders at what looked like a community dinner. The messages continued, each one striking Evelyn's heart like a bell of grace. People she'd never met, lives she'd never imagined touching, all connected by one simple act of obedience on a cold Thanksgiving day. Then came the final clip. Evelyn's breath caught as Rex's face filled the screen. He was sitting on his motorcycle, parked somewhere in the mountains at sunrise. His Bible, the same one now resting on her table, lay open on his handlebars. "Hey, Grandma," he said, his voice strong and clear. "If you're watching this, it means the boys finally got around to putting together that video we talked about." He chuckled, adjusting his bandana. "You know, I've been riding these roads for 30 years, thinking I was looking for freedom. Turns out I was looking for home. And you showed me something I'd forgotten. That kindness can turn a road into a home." He picked up his Bible, holding it close to his heart. "Been reading this again, like you encouraged me to. Remember that story about the widow's mite? How Jesus said she gave more than all the rich folks because she gave everything she had. That's what you did for us, Grandma. You gave everything, your food, your home, your heart. And look what God did with it." The camera panned out to show dozens of bikers gathered behind him, all holding Bibles. "We're doing Bible study now, if you can believe it," Rex grinned. "Right here on the road, because you reminded us that God's table is big enough for everybody." As the video ended, Evelyn found herself on her knees beside her chair, tears flowing freely. But these weren't the bitter tears of grief she'd been carrying. These were tears of understanding, of seeing the bigger picture God had been painting all along. "All right, Lord," she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If you're still writing this story, I'll keep setting the table." Rex knew it wasn't about the food. It was about making room for your love. So give me strength to keep the light burning, to keep the door open, to keep believing that every soul that comes through that door is sent by you. She stood slowly, her joints creaking, but her spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. Walking to her kitchen window, she looked out at the snow-covered yard where Rex and his friends had once parked their motorcycles. The morning sun was turning the snow into diamonds, and somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the rumble of engines. Evelyn smiled, touching the glass gently. "Your story's still being written, Rex," she whispered. "Through every life you touched, through every table that's being set. And I'm going to keep adding chapters, baby. That's a promise." The September breeze carried the scent of turning leaves as Evelyn, Ruth, and Reverend Coleman sat around Evelyn's kitchen table, surrounded by papers and planning notes. Through the open window, birds chirped their morning songs, while the three of them worked on organizing what would become the Open Table Ride, a new annual event to honor Rex's memory and continue his legacy of bringing people together. "Mama, are you sure about the scale of this?" Ruth asked, looking over the budget numbers with concern in her eyes. "We're talking about feeding thousands of people." Evelyn reached across the table and patted her daughter's hand. "Baby, when God multiplied those loaves and fishes, He didn't stop to count heads. He just kept giving until everyone was fed." Reverend Coleman nodded, his earlier reservations about bikers in his church long forgotten. "Evelyn's right. The donations are already coming in. Churches across 3 states want to participate. It's like—" He paused, searching for the right words. Like Rex's passing opened something in people's hearts. Over the next weeks, flyers appeared in shop windows, church bulletin boards, and biker bars across the South. The simple design showed a motorcycle silhouette against a setting sun with the words, "The Open Table Ride, in memory of Rex Steele Carson, all welcome at God's table." Social media carried the message further than they could have imagined. Evelyn didn't understand all the computer business, as she called it, but Ruth showed her how hundreds of shares turned into thousands. People began calling from as far away as Texas and Virginia, asking how they could help. The transformation of Hollow Creek Baptist Church's grounds started 3 days before Thanksgiving. Trucks rolled in from grocery stores and restaurants, loaded with donated food. Church ladies worked alongside leather-clad bikers, setting up long rows of tables under white tents that sprouted like mushrooms across the lawn. String lights crisscrossed overhead, twinkling like earthbound stars. The night before Thanksgiving, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, looking at Rex's Bible on her side table, remembering his voice reading scripture in those videos. "You see what you started?" she whispered, smiling through tears. "Your light's still burning, baby." Thanksgiving morning dawned clear and crisp. Evelyn arrived at the church, before sunrise, wearing the leather jacket the bikers had given her that first year. Ruth was already there, directing volunteers with a clipboard in hand, looking more like her mother than she'd ever admit. "The first groups are already on their way," Ruth said, checking her phone. "Highway Patrol says they're seeing motorcycles on every major road leading here." Around 8 o'clock, they heard it. The distant rumble that had once frightened the town now brought smiles to faces. It grew louder and louder until the very air seemed to vibrate. Then, over the hill they came, thousands of motorcycles, their chrome glinting in the morning sun. They filled the church parking lot, then the adjacent field, then lined both sides of the road for nearly a mile. Families climbed off bikes, children ran laughing between parked motorcycles, and the smell of turkey and barbecue filled the air from dozens of smoking grills. Near the temporary stage, they'd set up a small memorial for Rex, his leather jacket draped over a simple wooden cross with his Bible open in front of it. Throughout the day, people would stop there, some leaving flowers or notes, others just standing quietly in remembrance. At 10 o'clock, the crowd gathered for the opening ceremony. Ruth stood at the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notes. Evelyn stood beside her, proudly watching her daughter step into this moment. "Last year," Ruth began, her voice growing stronger, "I thought my mother was crazy for opening her door to strangers. I was scared for her safety, worried about what people would think." She paused, looking out over the sea of faces. But God had a bigger plan. Through one simple act of kindness, He showed us what church really means. It's not about buildings or traditions, it's about opening our hearts and our tables to everyone who hungers, whether for food or for love. The prayer that followed came straight from Ruth's heart, no notes needed. "Lord, thank you for Rex Carson, who taught us that it's never too late to come home to you. Thank you for my mother, who showed us that faith isn't faith until it opens the door. And thank you for bringing us all together today to continue what you started at one small table a year ago." News crews moved through the crowd, capturing the unlikely sight of church deacons serving alongside tattooed bikers, of children getting motorcycle rides from gentle giants, of old ladies in their Sunday best hugging rough-looking men with tears in their eyes. But unlike last year's media circus, this wasn't about sensation or spectacle. This was about showing the world what grace looked like when it put on working clothes. The day flowed like a beautiful dance, meals served in shifts, live music alternating between gospel and respectful rock, prayers offered spontaneously when someone felt moved by the Spirit. Even the weather cooperated, offering a perfect autumn day with just enough breeze to carry the smell of good food and the sound of laughter across the grounds. Evelyn moved through it all like a proud mother, hugging necks, wiping tears, and making sure everyone felt welcome. She kept finding herself drawn back to Rex's memorial, watching as tough bikers removed their bandanas and stood in quiet reflection, or as children placed small flowers beside his Bible. Late in the afternoon, she overheard two bikers talking near the memorial. One was showing the other a small Bible, identical to Rex's. "Got this last month," the first one said, running his hand over the leather cover. "Never thought I'd be one of those Bible-reading guys, but after hearing about Rex, well, figured it couldn't hurt to give it a try." "Yeah," his friend replied, nodding. "Amazing how one man's story can change so many others." Evelyn smiled, remembering Rex's words from the video. Kindness can turn a road into a home. Looking around at the thousands of people sharing meals, sharing stories, sharing hope, she saw his words come true in ways bigger than anyone could have imagined. As the sun began to set, the string lights twinkled to life overhead, casting a warm glow over the remaining crowds. The smell of coffee and dessert replaced the savory aromas of dinner, and the music softened to gentle acoustic guitars. Families lingered at tables, bikers gathered in circles sharing testimonies, and children dozed in their parents' arms. Ruth found her mother sitting quietly near Rex's memorial, watching it all with peaceful eyes. She sat down beside her, taking her hand. "You were right, Mama," she said softly. "God did know what He was doing that first Thanksgiving." "He always does, baby," Evelyn replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. "He always does." The November evening wrapped Hollow Creek in a gentle chill as the rumble of motorcycles gradually faded into whispers. Evelyn Mae Jackson settled into her familiar wooden rocking chair on the front porch, her weathered hands cradling a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The day's events had left her tired, but filled with a deep, satisfying peace. Wisps of smoke from dying campfires drifted through the air, mixing with the lingering sweetness of apple and pecan pies. She breathed it all in, letting the memories of the day settle in her heart. The laughter, the tears, the countless hugs, and most precious of all, the moments of quiet transformation she'd witnessed at Rex's memorial. The street before her house was finally quiet now, though tire tracks in the dirt told the story of the thousands who had come. Paper lanterns still swayed from trees, casting soft pools of light across her front yard. Empty plates and forgotten cups waited to be collected from the card tables scattered across her lawn, evidence of the feast that had touched so many lives. Ruth appeared in the doorway, carrying her own cup of tea. Without a word, she settled onto the porch step beside her mother's chair, leaning her head against Evelyn's knee, just like she used to do as a little girl. The gesture made Evelyn's heart swell. How far they'd come from those first worried phone calls a year ago. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last few motorcycles wind their way down the hill. The riders moved slower now, as if reluctant to leave the warmth of community they'd found here. Each one that passed lifted a hand in farewell, and Evelyn raised hers in return, even though the growing darkness meant they probably couldn't see her. "You did it again," Ruth whispered, her voice full of wonder and something that sounded like pride. She reached up and squeezed her mother's hand. Evelyn shook her head, silver hair catching the porch light. "No, baby, we did." She emphasized the "we" with another squeeze of Ruth's hand. Because it was true. This year had been different. This time, the whole community had come together, with Ruth right there in the thick of it, organizing and serving alongside everyone else. As they sat there, one final motorcycle appeared at the bottom of the hill. The rider slowed to a stop, his chrome fenders gleaming in the streetlight. He turned in his seat, raising his gloved hand in a final wave. For just a moment, Evelyn thought of Rex and that first wave goodbye, and her heart tightened with bittersweet memory. Then the rider gunned his engine and disappeared around the curve, leaving only the cricket songs and the soft creak of Evelyn's rocking chair. The old porch light above them flickered, drawing Evelyn's attention. It was the same light that had guided those first 8 riders to her door last Thanksgiving, the light that had shown them the way to grace. She stood slowly, joints protesting after the long day, and reached up to adjust the dimming bulb. With practiced fingers, she turned it higher until it blazed bright and steady against the gathering dark. The warm glow spilled down the porch steps and across her front yard, a beacon in the night. "Let's keep it burning, Lord," she said softly, settling back into her rocker, "just in case someone's still hungry." Ruth looked up at her mother's face, illuminated by that steady light, and saw in it everything she'd come to understand about faith and love over this remarkable year. The light caught the silver in Evelyn's hair like a crown, and her eyes shone with the same unwavering welcome that had changed so many lives, including Ruth's own. The light reached out into the darkness, strong and sure, a testament to the power of one open heart, one open door, one open table. It stood as a promise that grace would always have a home here, that hunger, whether of body or spirit, would always find satisfaction at Evelyn's table. Mother and daughter sat together in the growing night, watching that light shine steady and true, while somewhere in the distance, the last echoes of motorcycle engines faded into the gentle Alabama dark. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.